I'm Campbell Roberts.
And I'm Sue Hay, and in this episode we're talking about our children.
For me, one of the most memorable and most poetic passages from the Gospels is that of Matthew 19:14, where Jesus says, "Let the little children come to me, and don't hinder them, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these." All of us personally, as families and as a community, understand fundamentally the special gift that children are, and the specialness of childhood. Whenever we receive news of a New Zealand child being harmed, there appears to be a collective outpouring of anger and grief, as if we're all somehow involved and in a little way we feel responsible.
And so we should, because we do have a collective responsibility to all of our children. As the saying goes, it takes a village to raise a child, but maybe it also takes a nation to make sure that children are well looked after. As we continue to look at issues that might influence how we vote, we are going to discuss the sorry fact that perhaps as many as a quarter of New Zealand children live in relative poverty. We are also going to offer you some ideas on what we might be able to do about this.
I'm Nikki Turner. I work as a GP in Wellington, and I work as an academic GP at the University of Auckland as an associate professor in the Department of General Practice and Primary Healthcare. Well, I've worked for a long time in low-income general practice, and what I see is incredibly frustrating, that you see children who come from backgrounds of poverty visiting the doctor again and again and again, and they're always much more sick than children who don't come from backgrounds of poverty. And why is this? Some of the obvious reasons are that, well, firstly, it costs money to visit a doctor. It costs money if the child is older, the cost of the prescriptions, the parents trying to get to the doctors, there's all those barriers. But there's a lot of other hidden barriers. Children in poverty do not eat well, and if you don't eat well, you get recurrently sick. Children in poverty are under a lot of stress, and we all know that being under stress makes us sick. They often have terrible housing conditions. So there's a whole lot of added reasons why a child who comes from poverty gets sick more often. And the frustrating thing I've seen is children that have ended up in hospital 3, 4, 5 times before they're 5 or 6. And my own children have never been in hospital. These children are more prone to accidents, their asthma gets worse, they end up with pneumonia, they end up with skin infections, and it goes on and on. So they come into general practice, we fix them up, and they come in again. And their parents are doing the best job they can in the world often, and yet the stresses and the difficulties of coming from poverty really block them from being able to go forward.
By one measure, there are as many as 270,000 New Zealand children living in relative poverty. Many people dispute such figures or attempt to trivialise them, even suggesting there is no such thing as poverty in New Zealand.
Certainly in New Zealand, we do not have the desperate poverty of the developing world, and it is important to distinguish between this sort of poverty, known as absolute poverty, and relative poverty, which sadly is widespread in our country. The existence and persistence of relative poverty, especially the poverty of children, is something of a moral slippery slope. If the present poor conditions in which many Kiwis' kids live today is acceptable, then what is to stop these conditions getting worse? If tonight it is okay for a family to live in a cold, damp garage because this is all they can afford, will it also be okay for them to live in a car tomorrow night and in a bus shelter next week?
As with many moral questions, we need a bottom line. We need to agree on a point beyond which things aren't acceptable. Many of us believe that this point's already been reached with child poverty here in New Zealand.
The Salvation Army believes we need 3 major changes to the way we address child poverty in New Zealand. These are around family incomes, supporting mothers, and protecting children. Firstly, giving low-income families more money is not the total answer to the problem of child poverty, but it will help. From our own experience, the Salvation Army knows that many families with children simply are not getting sufficient income to meet basic living costs, especially in Auckland and Christchurch, where rents are rising rapidly. As an intermediate step, we believe government should extend Working for Families payments to all families with children. Over the next 2 to 3 years, we also believe that government should review its whole approach to income support. Such a review should make sure that adequate incomes are available to all families and should remove the many disincentives arising from the present approaches.
Secondly, it's clear that a child's poverty is really the poverty of his or her mother. Poor, uneducated and most often young women are often the mothers of poor children. To break what appears to be an intergenerational cycle, government agencies and communities need to work out new ways of supporting young mothers to look after their children, as well as giving them help to gain a better education and to address other personal challenges. The vehicle of early childhood education, such as kongareo, play centres and kindergartens, seems an excellent opportunity for this.
And thirdly, our child abuse and neglect statistics remain a national disgrace. While child protection agencies are working hard to address this problem, two issues stand out. The first is the fact that despite all the attention, there are over 22,000 cases of child abuse and neglect each year, year after year. Nothing is changing. The second thing is that we appear to have dropped the ball on family violence. Levels of reported violence remain much the same, and the police's approach to this problem seems to have changed without any public debate. The Salvation Army believes that we need to reignite this public campaign against domestic violence. In doing so, we also need to figure out how the work of police in child, youth and family around family violence and child abuse can be subject to greater public input and scrutiny. If New Zealanders can be offered a clear picture of the persistent problems around this violence and abuse, then we can more accurately assess if enough is being done to address these challenges. Right now, it is not clear if we are being effective in our interventions.
Mahatma Gandhi once said that the measure of a country's greatness should be based on how well it cares for its most vulnerable populations. It must surely be the case that the real measure of a New Zealand society is how we treat our most vulnerable children. As you consider your vote in our upcoming election, please think about the interests of our kids. Kids in your family and in your neighbourhood, and all Kiwi kids. While there's ample political debate going on around the importance of children, little has changed for some of these children over the past decade, except that they've grown up in poor and stressed families. Many of these children potentially will have been marred by this experience, and it's all been so unnecessary.
Do take the trouble to vote in this year's election and make your vote count for the sake of our children. In the last of our series, we will be considering the issue of crime in our communities.